We can now start evaluating contextualism according to how well it captures the kind of criteria that Hawthorne was interested in. So remember we said that the very first one was closure. Hawthorne thinks it's a necessary condition on any solution to the lottery paradox that it upholds closure. Now we already saw that contextualism of the kind Lewis endorses does validate closure. The basic reason was that we can isolate the knowledge set on these kinds of contextualist views, and once you do that, you can use the pictures that we've used in previous lectures to convince ourselves that closure holds. I'm not going to go through that reasoning in detail again, but the video is there if you want to see it for yourself one more time. So that's one thing in the contextualist's favour. They get the closure principle right. However, they don't seem to do as well on the other criteria. So let's start with the chance one. Well, one way to look at this is to consider the most robustly chancy things you can think of. So we've been talking about lotteries, we've been talking about the chance of dropping dead from a heart attack or being hit by a car. It is maybe open to question how objectively chancy these really are. Maybe if you know all the high-level facts about the world, that will often be enough to know whether these things are going to happen or not. But it is supposed to be true as a matter of physics that some things are objectively chancy. So for instance, it is, Hawthorne tells us, a fact of quantum mechanics that if I were to drop this marker onto the table, there is some chance that rather than bouncing off it as it normally would, it will just pass through the table. Don't worry too much about the mechanics of why this would happen. Just take it for granted that this is something that is theoretically possible if quantum mechanics is true, which we take it to be. So this means that there is some chance that when I drop this marker, it's going to pass through the table. Now, of course, this is extremely unlikely. Overwhelmingly, the chance is that the marker will hit it and bounce back, as it normally does. In fact, the chance is so high that I could continually drop the marker again and again and again, and I should expect not to see it pass through the table. That's something I should expect to barely ever happen. I should expect this to basically never happen. However, there is a chance it will happen. There is still some small chance it will happen. And notice it doesn't sound any better in this case to say, there's some chance the marker will pass through the table, although I know it won't. Even here, bringing up the chance that this unusual event might happen seems to be in tension with claiming knowledge that it won't. So how well does contextualism explain what's going on in this case? Well, Hawthorne says, not very well. The first thing he wants to claim is that the chanciness of the marker is not context sensitive. It's true in all contexts that there's some small chance the marker will pass through the table, because this is just a truth of quantum mechanics, he thinks, and that's not something that's a context sensitive matter. However, the whole point of the contextualist solution is that there are some ordinary contexts in which it is true to say things like, I know the marker will hit the table and bounce back. So it's just part of the contextualist story that there are some contexts where that's true. But then when we put those two things together, we see that there must be contexts where it's true that there is some chance the marker will pass through the table rather than bouncing back. But it's also true that you know that that won't happen. Remember, this is not what we wanted. We wanted some way to explain why there's a tension between saying you know something and saying there's some chance it won't happen. And Hawthorne's point is he thinks that there isn't really an explanation in this particular case for why those two things are incompatible. We know in some contexts the ordinary knowledge claim must be true, but we also know in all contexts there's some small chance, or it's true that there's some small chance the marker will pass through the table. So for examples like these, the supposed tension between chance and knowledge is not explained. Our other two criteria were about assertion and practical reasoning. So we wanted our explanation to respect the fact that there seems to be a connection between what you're permitted to assert and what you know, and the fact that there's a connection between what you're allowed reason from, what premises you're allowed to assume in your reasoning, and what you know. In both cases, the requirement was that you can assert things or you can take them for granted just in case you take yourself to know them. So how well does the contextualist respect these two connections? Hawthorne wants to say it's actually not obvious that they do a great job here, because when you start thinking about cross-contextual evaluation, there's this disconnect that can open up between your evaluations of how well people are asserting or how well they're reasoning, and whether they count as knowing by your standards. So let's consider a picture of a situation where there's cross-contextual evaluation going on. Well, imagine we've got Alice here. She's talking to her partner and saying, I'm not going on safari this year. And we'll imagine that she's in an ordinary standards context. On the standards she uses for knowledge, and what knows means in her context, she's asserting something that she knows. It would be true for her to say that she knows what she said. Let's also imagine we have Billy, who's listening from the next room. And we'll imagine that Billy is in a lottery context. Maybe in particular he's thinking about the lottery ticket that Alice just bought yesterday. So in his context, the claim that Alice knows she's not going on safari is false, because he's attending to the lotteries. Okay, so let's first think, is Alice asserting what she should be asserting? Or is she asserting something that she should not be asserting? Well, Hawthorne says, it looks very natural to say that she isn't doing anything that she shouldn't be doing. She's permitted to assert what she does. Because after all, she is asserting in accordance with the standards in her own context. The thing she is saying is something that she could truly say that she knows in her context, since her context involves ordinary standards. So Hawthorne wants to say, even in Billy's context, it's true to say that Alice is saying something she should be saying, or at least she's not saying something she shouldn't be saying. That's true even in Billy's mouth, Hawthorne wants to say. Or put it differently, whether Alice is asserting something she should or shouldn't be is not a context-sensitive matter. If it's true in one context that Alice is asserting what she should be asserting, then it's true in all contexts that she's asserting what she should be asserting. But now notice that Billy can say something pretty odd about Alice, if that's true, given contextualism about knowledge as well. Because remember, in Billy's mouth, it's not true to say of Alice that she knows what she said is true. In fact, she doesn't know what she said. So now, if it's right that it's a context-insensitive matter, whether Alice was asserting appropriately, Billy can say things like, Alice was permitted to say what she did, even though she didn't know it was true. Or she didn't say anything wrong by saying that she was going on safari, even though she didn't know that. And as Hawthorne says, that looks like a pretty odd result. It doesn't look like we really want to be able to say of people in context that they're saying things that they don't know. Remember, there's supposed to be this connection between what you're allowed to assert and what you know. So it's not clear that contextualism really properly captures that connection, Hawthorne thinks. Contextualism seems to face a similar problem when it comes to the point about practical reasoning. Again, there's this disconnect between your evaluations of how well people are reasoning and whether they count as knowing by your standards in these kind of cross-contextual cases. So there's no reasoning going on in our case yet, but we can easily imagine that there is. So let's imagine that Alice says, well, I'm not going on safari this year, therefore I'm going to spend that money, or I'm going to spend some of my savings on a stereo. So she says, so I'll buy the stereo. So we're imagining that since she's not saving up for this big trip because she knows she's not going to have enough money, she can just go ahead and make some other purchase. So again, if we look at Alice's context and we ask how well is she reasoning, it looks like this is perfectly good practical reasoning. It looks like it's perfectly okay for her to rely on the fact that she's not going on safari and conclude from that she should buy the stereo instead. It looks like when she's just in an ordinary context, she should take for granted that she's not going on safari. Indeed, it would be foolish for her to save money to go on safari. Remember, she knows that her paycheck this year is not going to be enough. So it looks like this is a good piece of practical reasoning. And moreover, you might think it is not a context-sensitive matter whether Alice has reasoned correctly here or not. It's not a context-sensitive matter whether she has reasoned well. If it's true in this context, then it's true in every context that she's reasoned well. So in particular, it's even true in lottery contexts that Alice is reasoning appropriately. But now notice, just like in the case of assertion, we can say some pretty weird things about Alice. Or at least Billy can. Billy can say things like, Alice is reasoning perfectly well, even though she's taking for granted things she doesn't know to be true. This seems pretty weird because remember when we talked about the selling a lottery ticket case, it looks like the criticism you would make is that you would say that somebody is relying on something that they don't know, and that's why their reasoning has gone wrong. So it's not obvious we should want people in lottery context to be able to look at Alice's context and to say Alice is reasoning well even though she's relying on premises that she doesn't know. Now, of course, an important premise in both of these two cases, in both the case of assertion and the case of practical reasoning, is that it isn't a context-sensitive matter whether people are doing those appropriately. Remember, we said Hawthorne assumes that if it's appropriate in one context, then it's appropriate in every context. And of course, he anticipates that you might question that premise. But one way to see that that's not a really appealing way to go, or it's not obviously appealing way to go, is to really focus on the case of practical reasoning. So remember, in this case, with the practical reasoning, we want to say that Alice is being perfectly rational in deciding to buy the stereo rather than trying to save up for going on safari. If you want to take the route of going context sensitive for our evaluations of how well she's reasoning, you have to be willing to say that when you're in a lottery case, you should be willing to say of Alice that she shouldn't take for granted that she's going on safari. She should leave open the possibility that she was going to win the lottery, and for that reason should maybe not buy the stereo, or at least should not reason in this way that she should buy the stereo. And that's not obviously right. I think it's easy to get into the frame of mind where even when you're in a lottery case, when you see other people reasoning in this way, when you see Alice reasoning in this way, you're perfectly happy to say that's a very reasonable thing for her to do. She's not being irrational. To bring it out even further, it seems natural to think that there's going to be a difference, even in lottery cases, between how well you think somebody like Alice is doing and how well you think somebody who's willing to sell their lottery ticket for 1 cent is doing. Remember, we said that it doesn't look like you should automatically conclude that you should sell your lottery ticket for 1 cent because it's going to lose. It doesn't look like you can take for granted the claim that it's going to lose. Now, of course, in lottery contexts, you're especially going to say that that reasoning is inappropriate. But notice that even when you're in the lottery frame of mind, it looks like you might want to draw a distinction between the case of selling your lottery ticket for 1 cent and the conclusion that Alice should buy the stereo. Or to put it differently, you evaluate differently somebody who takes for granted that their ticket is going to lose and Alice who's taking for granted that she's not going to be going on safari. Even in the lottery case, you might think it's still more permissible to rely on the premise that you're not going on safari than it is to rely on the premise that you know your ticket is going to lose. There still seems to be some difference between those, even when you're in lottery cases. And this difference would be hard to explain if our evaluations were context sensitive. Because if our evaluations were context sensitive, you would expect them to go the same way. You would expect that whenever you're in a context where this seems okay, it also seems okay to take for granted that your ticket will lose. And likewise, whenever you're in a context where it's bad to take for granted that your ticket will lose, it's also bad to take for granted that you're not going to go on safari. But as we said, it looks like in every context we're willing to make a distinction between those two cases. In every context, it seems better to take this for granted than to take for granted that your ticket is going to lose. So that's a way to respond to this natural idea that maybe our evaluations are context sensitive. So in sum, the problem here, as we said, is that there's this disconnect between how we evaluate others' assertions and others' reasoning and what we're willing to say that they know. When we evaluate how well people are asserting or reasoning, we evaluate them according to their own standards. However, when we make knowledge claims about them, we evaluate them according to our standards for knowledge. This then leaves open the possibility to say sort of weird things about them. We can say that they're asserting things perfectly permissibly, even though they don't know them, and they're reasoning from premises perfectly permissibly, even though they don't know these premises. And given that we saw that there's this connection between assertion and knowledge, and practical reasoning and knowledge, these look like odd things to be able to say. As we wrap up, we should zoom out and think about what the moral of all this is. And one thing Hawthorne is very clear about is he doesn't think the moral is contextualism is therefore necessarily false. He's very clear, in fact, that he's just drawing up a scorecard and showing that there are some serious shortcomings to contextualism that contextualists need to answer. And indeed, he does this for all the views he draws up in the book. and settles for his own view in the end on the basis of it doing overall better, and not that there are no problems for the view that he likes in the end. But perhaps more importantly, he also doesn't think that the lesson here is that contextualism is getting everything wrong. Indeed, he wants to say that there are some aspects of the contextualist explanation here that are really getting onto something right. By appealing to salience, by appealing to stakes, by appealing to what we're attending to, these kinds of things that contextualists do, contextualists really are getting at something important about knowledge. And indeed, Hawthorne's own explanation is going to draw on these notions. What he does think the contextualist is getting wrong is the way that they get these notions into the picture. The way that the contextualist gets these notions into the picture is through the context of use. Remember, the idea is that context of use determines what possibilities are relevant. Relevance is partly a matter of salience and things like that. So it's through the context of use that things like salience and stakes get into the true conditions of knowledge claims. It's this route into the true conditions of knowledge claims that Hawthorne really objects to. He thinks in this book that it's rather through the subject situation, the person that we're talking about, the person that we're ascribing knowledge. It's their stakes, it's what's salient to them that are relevant to knowledge attributions, and not necessarily what's relevant to the ascriber. And the reason he thinks it shouldn't be done through the ascriber is because of precisely the problems that we just saw. We saw that by tying them to the context of use, we get this disconnect between what knowledge claims are true on the one hand, and the evaluations we're willing to make of people's assertions and practical reasoning on the other. Of course, the natural thing to make of all this is that we want our evaluations of assertion and practical reasoning to work in the same way as our evaluations of knowledge do. If our evaluations of assertion and practical reasoning go by the standards of the subject, then maybe we also want our evaluations of knowledge to go by the standard of the subject too. And this is exactly what we're going to work towards next week when we talk about moderately sensitive invariantism.